I'm going to mainly focus my attention on something called design representation and our interpretation of what that means. But I'm also, towards the end of the presentation, going to bring in an idea from cognitive science, from psychology, called distributed cognition as a means to understand the role and use of design representation in design. And when I talk about design, I must say my industry background and my background as an academic is product and industrial design. So I'm coming at this from the lens of a product industrial design perspective. Okay, there we go. This is an illustration or a cartoon produced by a colleague of mine, Koos Eisen, formerly at TU Delft, now retired. And it kind of illustrates kind of an archetypal or quintessential designer. And this designer is attempting to communicate ideas to other stakeholders. And you can imagine this character here might be a CEO or a client of some kind. And the designer is using a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, you can imagine there might be some representation or some expression of the designer's intention. So it could look something like this. So in this sense, the designer is attempting to communicate through design representation. And when I talk about design representation, what I'm talking about here really is the pictorial representation of design intention. And so the designer here is maybe, during conceptual design ideation, using a sketch or an illustration in order to communicate a potential idea to other stakeholders. But of course, these kinds of representations might be necessarily ambiguous. Ambiguous because that ambiguity also affords a kind of interpretation or reinterpretation of the design as communicated by the representation. But then that same ambiguity could potentially cause problems for communication in the sense that we bring our own baggage to the interpretation of design intention as expressed through these representations. So in their ambiguity, different individuals with different expertise may see and understand these designs differently depending on their interpretations. So do you like rabbits or do you prefer ducks? But I think importantly for design representation as well as communication, representations are used to explore. This is actually a video. I don't know whether I can get it to play. It seems to not be a video anymore, but it's okay if it doesn't play. It's okay. This was a time-lapse video of a study that we did some years ago at UNIST. I should say I'm also the director of a small research group called the Design Thinking Research Lab at UNIST. And we looked at the way that designers use sketches and illustrations in order to explore the potential of design solutions. And this was a time lapse of a participant engaging in sketching as a means to explore ideas through their expression, through their representation as more ambiguous, let's say, conceptual sketches. So I think representations can be used for both communication and also for personal exploration. And I should say that in this kind of situated activity of sketching, there was no verbal discussion or verbal communication of the design. It was all to do with this articulation and expression of intent through representations. I also want to say one thing or a little bit more about representations in terms of this idea of approximation. In a nice book by Ulrich and Eppinger, they talk about approximation of design intent in prototypes and models. But I think it can be, the concept of approximation could potentially be expanded to cover all types of what I would describe as iconic design representations. So for example, this in industry we call a block model or a white block model. And there are certain things that this representation of design intent does communicate and certain things it doesn't communicate. So it approximates design ideas, but at different dimensions of interest or different levels or different aspects. So for example, it communicates and approximates form factors to a high level of fidelity. It potentially communicates interaction points or touch points, but it doesn't communicate CMF. It doesn't communicate technical functionality. That's okay. So we can think about design representations as expressions of design ideas, as expressions of intention, as approximating design on different levels of different dimensions of interest. And so we can use the idea of approximation of design intent to think about what design representations might do, how they may be used, how they may be applied in design process, and the implications about what that could tell us about design thinking. To say a bit more about approximation, we can think about the expression and representation, the approximation of design intention along perhaps a dichotomous scale between low fidelity and high fidelity. This is a design of a product from one of my colleagues at UNIST. It's actually an automatic eyelash extender, but anyway, this is actually not the final product. This is called a pre-production prototype. But in this expression of design intention, it's high fidelity in the sense of its distance from the final manufactured product. It's very close. It expresses and communicates on various dimensions of interest, various levels, various aspects: technical functionality, usability, CMF design, form factors. On the other end of this scale, we might see something like this, and they can also include sketches and illustrations. This is what's called a sketch model or a quick and dirty prototype in industry. And this is low fidelity in the sense that it's quite a distance away from the final produced design solution. And we may be able to also map these types of representations onto design process that moves from, we talked about divergence and convergence in previous presentations, so it moves from divergent conceptual exploration through development design and into detailed design specification. And so the types of representations used, their approximation of design intentions, the level of detail that they express ideas, maybe follows this process of convergence to development into from divergence, into convergent and detailed specification. And you can see this here. This is quite a famous example of the use of design representations to drive a process. You can see the way that the types of representations used in this process move from kind of explorative, low fidelity, low detail expression of design intent through development design and into detailed design specification prior to manufacture. Comprehensive in the sense that they comprehensively attempt to communicate on various dimensions of interest at a high level of detail the potential design solution. I want to say probably one more thing about representation. And I'm going to try and scaffold this or frame this in terms of semiotic theory. So semiotic theory is the idea that we understand the world around us through signs, and we build meaning through signs. And essentially there are three types of sign. One I'm going to put to the side for the purposes of applying semiotic theory to understand design representation. I'm going to talk about symbolic representation and iconic representation. So the image here is actually an image of my son, and he's using mathematical equations to try to come to a solution to a maths problem. This image here is actually taken from one of the images from our recent book publication. And And in this image, the designer is using a different type of representations, iconic representations, as approximations of design intentions, again, to explore the potential of design ideas. So, for example, if we frame design representation as iconic, it might look something a bit more like this. So this attempts to communicate information, and the information is communicated through visualization that approximates a battery, approximates a charger. In contrast to this, iconic theory suggests that there is a group of signs that are symbolic. So we need to understand the English language to be able to understand the information communicated through this representation. Now, I'm not saying that language is not important to design. Of course it is. But when we look at design representations, we're particularly interested in the iconic expression of design intention. And I think the reason for that is, I'm going back to when I was a practitioner in industry, where I used to use these representations day to day, and then in my research since. I think there are a ubiquity and variety of design representations often used in practice to support design. Conceptual sketches, illustrations, drawings, renderings, models and prototypes at various levels of detail and fidelity on different dimensions of interest. They communicate design intentions. They provide opportunities for exploration, for communication. But I suppose I think what kind of unites them all is that they are used as possibility to approximate design ideas, approximate the form factors, the materiality, usability, technical functionality of design ideas. And in those approximations provide space for both communication and also exploration, development, and final specification, if we think about them in terms of the design process. I wonder how long I've got. So I've spoken a little bit about design representation, and maybe we can start to think about coming to an operational definition of this type of representation, of design representation. I've mentioned a few aspects of design representations. They support communication, exploration. They provide interpretation. They're approximations of design intent. They work on various levels of detail, and the particular type of representation that we're most interested in are iconic representations according to semiotic theory, or the application of semiotic theory. So I'm going to finish by saying a little bit about distributed cognition. I should say that this is kind of the new part of what we're looking at, and I suppose I'm skating on a bit of thin ice by starting to talk about something I don't know much about. But essentially, distributed cognition comes from cognitive science and psychology, and it's a way of understanding thinking as an embodied experience. So if I understand the theory correctly, it's to do with the way that thinking or cognition may extend into our environment, and in that extension to our environment, the things that we use in the environment, the materiality of our environment influences our thoughts, our cognition. And so in this sense, thinking is not contained within the mind, it's not skull-bound, but it extends into our environment. And this might be something quite interesting when we're thinking about design representation, the role and use of iconic design representation, the way that follows processes of design from divergent conceptual ideation through development design into detailed design specification. How that might help us understand the role and use of representation in terms of furthering understanding of design thinking itself. And I think if we think about more established theory in design over the last 30 or 40 years, we have some established theory in design. So a classical example is Schoen's ideas around reflection in action, and the way that he talks about the materiality of the reflective experience of reflection in action, I don't know whether he was explicit about citing distributed cognition, but it seems there are parallels between ideas around reflection in action, conversations with the materiality of the situation, and thinking about design representations in terms of an opportunity for distribution or distributed cognition. Again, we can think about other theory that has become more established in design. So there is something called Appositional Reasoning, of course, reasoning between problem and solution spaces, and Cross and Dorst spoke about this. And it might be that design representations offer a scaffold or an opportunity for bridge building between the problem space and the solution space. So in the articulation of or expression of design intention through design representation, these design representations offer a possibility to bridge build between an understanding of the design problem and a reframing of the original, an understanding of potential design solutions and a reframing of the original design problem, kind of a bridge building effect. Maybe to close, to think about distributed design thinking, or to look at design thinking through the lens of distributed cognition, might kind of offer up some interesting further avenues of inquiry. So if we are saying that the role and use of design representation, iconic design representation, is fundamental to design, and it might be a type of, potentially even a higher level type of distributed cognition, what does that mean in terms of the tools that designers use, for example, to construct representations? So the use of CAD versus sketching, for example. What does that mean in terms of the types of communication, the use of oral communication versus the use of iconic representations, for example? So I think that thinking about design thinking through a distributed lens offers some potential opportunity to further understanding of the role and use of representation and the implications that has for understanding design thinking itself. Probably too many times, but if you're interested to know more, you could potentially have a look at our book that was very recently published. And our group also has a website that you could potentially look at. I must confess it hasn't been updated for a while, but that's something that we need to do. And maybe there's some space for some questions on distributed design thinking, particularly the idea that, distributed cognition could potentially be a useful way to look at design representation, the use of design representation in design thinking. Thank you.